So what we've been doing collectively, deliberately in the UK for the past 4 years or so is working together to change how we communicate, particularly outside the profession, whether it's to the public or to the media or to government or just people interested in homeopathy. We're backing up our statements now much more carefully and clearly with evidence, which can only be a good maturation of our profession. When we think about how we actually counter some of the misinformation about homeopathy, it was fascinating to take a step back and think about strategy rather than just the pure academics of the situation of the evidence base. Because when you look at where we found ourselves, it really comes down to 2 documents. That's it, really. Most of the attacks now all trace back at some point to 2 documents. One is known as the S&T report in the UK, and one is the Shang paper. So if we start by thinking about these 2 documents, where we're starting from, because we have to work from there. The S&T report, I feel like I've been going around the world for the last 18 months apologising on behalf of the UK for bringing trouble to the rest of the world. This report came out of a select committee in our parliament, a small group of MPs who did what they said was an evidence check. What is the evidence around homeopathy? But it's become a monster of its own nature, and it's been extrapolated into all sorts of other areas. So I went back to the actual transcripts of the second session, and in that transcript, the chair of the entire proceedings says, "Could I put on record, because there seems to be a little confusion about the nature of the work that we are doing. This is not an inquiry into whether homeopathy works or not. I want to make that absolutely clear." They then produced a report with 2 conclusions. Number 1, homeopathy works no better than placebo. Number 2, there should be no more research carried out into homeopathy. Doesn't actually get firmer than that. Now, I will not go into length about all the ways in which that process was flawed, and the eventual report that was produced was flawed, because we go on to that later. But what's striking is it is flawed. It is a rubbish report. It is not an academic document of any kind, and yet it's been incredibly effective as an instrument for people to stop homeopathy in its tracks. And I think it's because it was a single document. We have this huge debate that's been running for probably 200 years, but has got really complex recently. And I think people genuinely didn't know what to do, the decision makers. You know, they've got the homeopaths saying one thing, the anti-homeopathy lobby saying another. What do? Suddenly, here is one document that seems to have the answer. We're a group of MPs, we've looked at the evidence, and we're telling you it's rubbish. So that has been leapt on by organisations all over the UK and then also internationally. I've heard of that report being used at a meeting in Canberra in Australia to try and make it, try and claim that homeopathy is unethical for Australian homeopaths to be practising. So it's had that far a reach, about as far as you can go. I've also had friends of mine saying when they went to get ethical approval for a project, they'd turn up for the ethics committee hearing and then suddenly say, sorry, you're not even coming in the room. We've decided not to hear your case. We're not going to look at your protocol because of this report. And they held up the S&T report. So it is actually quite astonishing. The other one, you might have heard of this. The Lancet published this global comparative meta-analysis in 2005, and the editor hailed it as the end of homeopathy. Well, we're still here, so it wasn't quite right. But again, a paper in 2005 that is utterly flawed is still causing us problems today. And you probably know all the key ways in which this Shang meta-analysis is flawed. But probably the biggest for me is when you think about the fact that they originally started with 110 trials of homeopathy and 110 trials of allopathy, and were comparing them. And in a normal process you would do with a review, they obviously excluded certain trials. So what they ended up analysing in the end was only 8 trials of homeopathy and 6 trials of conventional medicine, which could be okay if the method was good. There's nothing wrong with that, except that when you see how it's being used now, that means that basically the judgment has been made on the whole of homeopathy as an intervention based on 8 trials being analysed by one group. And of course, they're all different trials. None of them are actually dealing with individualised prescribing. None of them are actually homeopathy as we would perhaps define it in this room, which is just one of the issues. One of the other really important issues for me is the fact that it fails what they call a sensitivity analysis. So if you're doing this process of only using some trials that are available, you have to obviously justify that. And one of the ways that you check that your results are sound is you should be able to change exactly which trials we used, exactly which 8 in this case, to some extent and get the same result. Otherwise, there must be something wrong in your selection. And Peter Fisher, who I'm sure many of you have heard speak, has also gone around the world apologising a lot because it's one of his trials that completely skews the result against homeopathy. He did a big trial on marathon runners in Arnica, which was negative, which I think, you know, we can all look at why that was negative. And if you take that one trial out of the 8, the whole result changes. It's actually in favour of homeopathy, saying it's not necessarily placebo. So you can see how much this can shift. So we end up with the Shang paper still causing problems, with only 8 trials actually being relevant. There has been huge, widespread criticism of Shang. I mean, there's so much to say about it that's wrong. You could take all day. Slow down, sorry. I will slow down. I'll be a bit more zen. It's hard when it's so annoying. Okay. So, widespread, slowly delivered criticism of Shang. People have talked about this in academic papers. So the point for me next was to say, if all these really good scientists have spelt out what's wrong with Shang, why is Shang still working for the skeptics? Why hasn't it gone away? So it made a lot of us think about the fact that it's not just the facts that are important, it's how you communicate those facts about the research. And just writing great papers, I mean, it has to be done, but we clearly need something more. We clearly need a way to pull out from that academic data the messages people need to know.